In 1940, a French railway worker watched in disbelief as German soldiers drilled holes into the largest operational tank ever built. They weren't trying to capture it. They were preparing to blow it apart. The Char 2C had traveled barely 50 kilometers from its garage before French crews abandoned it on the tracks. 12 men, 75 tons of steel, and a fatal design flaw that would doom it before a single shot was fired in anger. The story begins not in 1940, but 22 years earlier, in the frozen hell of Verdun. 1916, the Battle of Verdun grinds into its 8th month. 300,000 men are dead. The French High Command watches in horror as German artillery turns their soldiers into statistics. Then, on September 15th, something changes. Across the channel at the Somme, the British unleash a new weapon. They call it a tank. 32 of them lurch across no man's land. Most break down. Many get stuck. But the ones that make it through terrify the Germans into retreat. The French generals take notice. If the British can build mechanical monsters, France can build something bigger. Something that would make the enemy flee before the first shell was loaded. The French concept was simple in its ambition and insane in its execution. They would build a land battleship. Not a tank that supported infantry. Not a breakthrough weapon for a single battle. A mobile fortress that could smash through any German defensive line and keep rolling until it reached Berlin. The specifications read like a fever dream. 75 tons. Longer than a city bus. Armed with a naval gun that could punch through concrete bunkers at 3,000 meters. Armor thick enough to laugh at German anti-tank rifles. A crew of 12 men working inside like submariners, living in a steel world that moved at the speed of a brisk walk. They called it the Char 2C. The name was deliberately bland, a bureaucratic code that hid the sheer audacity of what French engineers were attempting. While British tanks carried 6 men and weighed 28 tons, the Char 2C would be nearly 3 times heavier and require double the crew. While German tanks topped out at 7 tons, this beast would crush them like tin cans. The War Ministry demanded 10 of them by the end of 1918. The engineers promised delivery. Everyone nodded. No one mentioned that nothing like this had ever been built before. The design emerged from the drawing boards of Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, a shipyard more accustomed to building submarines than land vehicles. Perhaps that explains why the Char 2C looked like a submarine that had lost an argument with a railway car. 10.27 meters long, 2.59 meters wide, 4.09 meters tall when you counted the observation cupola on top. The body stretched so far that engineers needed to split it into 2 compartments. The front held the driver, the commander, the gunner, the loader, and the massive 75mm main gun. The rear compartment housed the engine, the mechanic, the electrician, and enough fuel tanks to theoretically keep this monster running for 150 kilometers. Theoretically. The armor was absurd. 45mm on the front, 20mm on the sides. Enough to stop anything the Germans fielded in 1918. The weight required a track system so complex it needed 33 road wheels per side. 33? Most tanks may do with 8 or 10. The Char 2C's tracks wrapped around the hull like iron blankets, each link weighing more than some men. The suspension had to absorb impacts that would shatter normal tank systems. Engineers added springs, added shock absorbers, added prayers. Power came from 2 Mercedes engines. Yes, German engines. Each produced 130 horsepower. Combined, they gave the Char 2C 260 horses to haul 75 tons of French ambition. The math was cruel. Top speed on roads, 15 kilometers per hour. Top speed off-road, walking pace. A soldier on foot could keep up with France's mightiest tank. But speed was never the point. This was a siege weapon, a breakthrough tool. You didn't rush it to the front. You shipped it by rail, unloaded it behind the lines, and let it crawl toward the enemy like an iron tsunami. Here's where the design revealed its fundamental problem. The Char 2C was too heavy for roads, too wide for most railcars, too complex for field repairs. It required custom rail wagons just to move between battles. It needed engineer crews to reinforce bridges before it could cross. It demanded supply chains that simply didn't exist in 1918. The French had built a weapon that needed the infrastructure of 1960 to function properly. Before we go on, if forgotten and impossible war machines fascinate you, subscribe to Forgotten War Relics and hit the bell so you never miss one. Production began in 1917. The first prototype rolled out in 1921, 3 years after the war ended. The factories had scrambled. The shipyards had worked through the armistice. But building a land battleship takes time. By the time the first Char 2C was complete, the trenches were filled in. The barbed wire was rusting. The Germans were forbidden from having tanks at all under the Treaty of Versailles. France had commissioned a weapon for a war that no longer existed. 10 were eventually completed. Each one cost the equivalent of 4 normal tanks. Each one required a dedicated railway car. Each one needed 12 trained crewmen who had to function like a ship's crew, not a tank squad. The French army looked at their 10 massive steel elephants and realized they'd built museum pieces before the museum even opened. But that didn't stop them from trying to make them relevant. For 20 years, these behemoths sat in their special garages, maintained by dedicated crews, ready for a war that military theorists promised would be nothing like the last one. They were right. The next war would move at 40 kilometers per hour, and the Char 2C could barely manage 15. The Char 2C never fired a shot in anger during World War I. That honor would have to wait 2 decades. By 1940, the 10 remaining tanks were museum pieces masquerading as frontline equipment. When Germany invaded France that May, the French High Command made a desperate decision. Roll out the land battleships. Show the enemy what a real fortress looks like. It was already too late. The first Char 2C broke down on its transport train heading to the front. Mechanical failure. The second made it to a railway yard before German Stukas found it. Bombs rained down. The armor that could stop anything from World War I meant nothing against aerial assault. The tank sat immobile on its flatbed car, a 75-ton coffin. The crew abandoned it and set demolition charges. When it exploded, fragments were found 300 meters away. 3 more were destroyed the same way, bombed on their trains before they could even unload. The Germans didn't need panzers to stop them. They just needed to find the railway lines. The Char 2Cs were so massive, so dependent on rail transport, that they announced their own positions. Each special transport train was a target marker, saying priceless pre-war relic here. One tank, number 99, actually made it off the train. It rolled under its own power for the first time in combat conditions. 12 men inside, 75 tons of steel. It traveled 14 kilometers in 6 hours. Then the engine overheated. The transmission seized. French engineers worked through the night trying to repair it while German forces advanced. They couldn't fix it. They couldn't even tow it. So they rigged it with explosives and walked away. When it detonated, local farmers said the blast shook windows 8 kilometers distant. The remaining tanks never left their depots. German forces captured 3 of them intact. Hitler himself toured one. Photos show him standing next to the massive track assembly, barely reaching halfway up. The Germans tested them, examined them, then scrapped them for steel. They were too slow, too complex, too expensive. Even as propaganda pieces, they were embarrassing. One Char 2C did survive. Number 95. It never saw combat, never even left its garage in 1940. The French hid it, buried it under camouflage netting and false walls. When the war ended, they pulled it back out, restored it, put it in a museum. It sits there today at the Musée des Blindés in Saumur, the last land battleship, a 75-ton monument to strategic obsolescence. The numbers tell the story better than words. Total Char 2C production, 10 tanks. Total combat engagements, 0 successful actions. Total enemy vehicles destroyed, 0. Total cost, enough to build 40 modern tanks. Total service life before obsolescence, negative 3 years. They were outdated before they were finished. But the Char 2C taught the world something crucial. Bigger is not better, heavier is not stronger. Armor means nothing if you can't get to the battlefield. The Germans learned this lesson and built panzers that could race across Poland in weeks. The Soviets learned it and built T-34s that could be mass-produced in months. The Americans learned it and built Shermans that could be shipped anywhere. The British learned it and built Churchills that could actually be repaired in the field. France built 10 tanks that needed 12 men and a railway line and perfect weather and 3 years of maintenance. 10 tanks that were defeated by stairs, by bridges, by slightly soft ground, by their own weight. The Maginot Line at least had the excuse of being stationary. The Char 2C pretended to be mobile while being more fixed than most fortifications. Military historians call it the ultimate example of fighting the last war. The Char 2C was the answer to 1916, perfect for crossing trenches that no longer existed, ideal for crushing barbed wire that had been pulled up years ago, unstoppable against machine gun nests that had been abandoned for 2 decades. It was a weapon perfectly designed to win a war that had already been lost. And that's the real legacy, not the impressive statistics, not the engineering marvel, not even the sheer audacity of building a 75-ton tank before anyone knew if such a thing was possible. The legacy is this. The Char 2C proved that innovation without adaptation is just expensive nostalgia. That preparing for the last war guarantees defeat in the next one. That sometimes the most impressive weapon is the most useless. France spent millions building 10 land battleships. Germany conquered France in 6 weeks, using tanks a quarter of the size. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to Forgotten War Relics for more of the strangest machines history forgot.